So today is Thursday, August
Correct.
5th, 2021, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. We certainly want to wish everyone safe keeping right now, and please check on your neighbors if there's any doubt that they are safe. I am Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowitz, who is joining us this morning via telephone. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary. And if I may I plug something?
Go for it.
So this month is the 30-year anniversary of the release of Oliver Stone's movie JFK. And in the last couple of weeks, he's released a sequel called JFK Revisited Through the Looking Glass. And it's narrated by Donner Sutherland and Whoopi Goldberg. And it follows up on the trove of declassified files relating to President Kennedy's assassination. And there is a far larger picture that is now known, including many links to Cuba, which our war against Cuba. The CIA, of course, was looking to overthrow Fidel Castro for almost the entire time he was leading Cuba. And, of course, Cuba is the subject of today's show. So there is a link between Cuba, the secret war against Cuba, and the fine work that Oliver Stone does. And I can't say enough good things about Oliver Stone's new movie JFK Revisited.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, John. Today's show and all programs will be archived here at KMUD and at our show website, that is heroespatriots.org. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests. That number, 707-923-3911, 923-3911. We'll take as many calls as time permits. We ask that you be brief with your question. Thank you today to KMUD engineer Dorothy Sakur for assisting with this program and all programs. Views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, or volunteers of KMUD Community Radio. One of the U.S.'s long-standing and most well-known sanctions is against the Republic of Cuba. In February 1959, Fidel Castro became Prime Minister of Cuba, unseating a post-revolution Cuban government that was favored by the United States. Ironically, the previous Batista regime was defeated in part because of a U.S.-imposed arms embargo. In the last several weeks, Cuban citizens have been railing against the government, even as President Biden is adding to the economic embargo. And in the last few days, China is calling for the lifting of all U.S. sanctions against Cuba. To help us understand these difficult issues around the history of both United States and Cuban relations is our guest, Carlos L. Garrido. Mr. Garrido is a Cuban-American philosopher, professor, and graduate student at Southern Illinois University. He is a co-founder and editor board member at Midwestern Marx, that's MARX, and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. He is also a political analyst with a focus on Latin American, especially Cuba. Mr. Garrido is an editorial board member and co-founder of the Journal of American Socialist Studies. Most recently, he appeared on a podcast titled Hands Off Cuba, which highlighted continuous attacks on Cuba by the U.S. government. We now welcome Carlos L. Garrido to the program. Are you with us?
Hello, yes. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. And this is a really timely and important show. And we're devoting the full hour to speaking with you, Carlos, if I may call you that. John is with us on the other line. John, you want to...
Good morning, Carlos.
Good morning.
Good morning, John.
So I'd like to start, John referenced John F. Kennedy and Oliver Stone's new movie. I'd like to start with a quote, if I might, that President Kennedy shared with Jean Daniel Beck on October 24th, 1963. And I'll read that and then we'll jump in from there. Quote, I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. I approved the proclamation which Fidel Castro made in the Sierra Maestra, where he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will even go further. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. That is perfectly clear. President Kennedy made those remarks 1 month and 2 days before he was killed. So let's start with, I'm not even sure, would you like to react to that comment?
Well, yeah, that's quite interesting because although the pressure on Cuba starts with the Eisenhower administration,
Right.
it's really the Kennedy administration that ends up fully implementing what we now call the blockade. But I think it's important to note that Cuba is a small island of 11 million, and it was an island that was made historically dependent on sugar through its colonial experience as a colony of Spain. Already towards the end of the 18th century, Cuba becomes the sugar hub of the world. And by 1860, Cuba is not only made dependent on sugar, but they're made dependent on trading sugar with the United States. So the United States presents itself as the historically and geographically natural trading partner of Cuba. Up until the time of the Cuban Revolutionary War of 1898, the U.S. and Cuba had these relations that Cuban dependency on sugar was also a Cuban dependency on trading that sugar with the U.S. With the Revolutionary War, in which the U.S. participated in with a sprinkle of yellow journalism, the U.S. occupies Cuba for 3 years, and Cuba qualitatively changes into a new phase from being a colonial periphery of Spain to being under what would be called American imperialism, modern imperialism. The U.S. would then, up until the time of the Revolution, occupy Cuba another 3 times, which includes a continual occupation of our favorite torture spot, Guantanamo Bay. But
Right.
in the time that the U.S. spends before the Revolution in Cuba, over those 60 years, what we find is that the relationship changes from one of economic dependency to one of political and economic supremacy of the U.S. over Cuba, and at times military supremacy as well. Most of the land in Cuba was owned by a small sector of people, and the biggest industries in Cuba and the biggest resources, the harvest from the biggest resources, mainly sugar, tobacco, were primarily things that ended up going to foreign multinationals out of the U.S. So when the revolution comes about, its main concern is an agrarian reform that redistributes land to end these large land monopolies that left the rest of Cubans in egregious condition, although a small percentage, which is the first ones to end up going to Miami, lived very well. But with the agrarian reform, Cuba finds itself directly from the inception of the revolution in a antagonistic position with U.S. interests, because the United Fruit Company played a big role in land distribution and land ownership and control over the sugar industry. So what we find in the first 1 or 2 years of the Cuban Revolution is that as the revolution progressively does redistributive measures, it continues to find itself in a position that is antagonistic to the interests of American corporations. And as those distributive measures are implemented, the U.S. then reacts and implements sanctions or restrictions on Cuba. This eventually kept on progressing until Cuba had to turn to the Soviet Union for oil, and then the Eisenhower administration prevents the oil refineries from refining Soviet oil. Cuba has to nationalize those corporations, and then shortly after you have the full implementation of the blockade. And we get in 1960 a memorandum from at the time, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Lester Mallory, who said, look, there's effectively no opposition in Cuba. In order for us to create an opposition, that favors American interests in the island, what we have to do is basically starve Cuba, put them in harsh material conditions, so that then we can have the conditions for the possibility of funding an opposition that can substantially oppose the revolution. And that philosophy, that by any means necessary philosophy, has been consistent over the last 60-something years of US-Cuba relations, with the exception of a short period of the Obama administration with the Cuban thaw, where he partially lifted sanctions. But I don't know if you want me to continue the historical analysis or to stop it.
Well, Don, do you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, it's this history and this background is crucial to invading Cuba. I was going to ask Carlos whether he'd like to talk about some of the militarism of the United States in reaction to Cuba. We had the invasion of Grenada in 1983. We had the invasion of Panama in 1989. And interestingly enough, and Carlos, I'm kind of a historian of Jim Jones in Jonestown because he got his start in Mendocino County, where I have a home. The People's Temple in Jonestown was actually a facility that was already built out and handed over to Jim Jones, and it had been a staging area in Guyana for a possible invasion of Cuba. So you have Grenada, you have Guyana, you have Panama, you have kind of like the ring of fire circling Cuba. And meanwhile, you have the CIA conducting its own secret war against Cuba. Talk a little bit just about some of our military and our covert operations against Cuba.
Yes, well, that's very important. People usually talk about the war on Cuba, and they limit themselves to the blockade, which, of course, is central and crucial. But the U.S. has used, as I mentioned, a by any means necessary philosophy, which has included military attacks, it has included biowarfare attacks, and has even at times included, sadly, the state terroristic attacks. I think most famously, military attacks, we have the example of the Bay of Pigs, which, is quickly squashed within 3 days. But we have examples of biowarfare attacks on Cuba that are pretty egregious. In 1971, some CIA agents infiltrated into Cuba the African swine fever virus, which destroyed a whole harvest and affected the population a lot, especially their food source. But then you also have, historically, the U.S. either looking away from terroristic activities done in Cuba, or CIA-funded agents doing terroristic activities to the Cuban population. And I think most famously the case of Orlando Bosch and the case of Luis Posada Carril come to mind, the latter which helped in blowing up a plane that killed 74 people. These are folks that are celebrated in the Miami exile community. It's also important to note that not only has there been these tactics done against Cuba and Cuban citizens and done on Cuban soil, but as Operation Northwood shows, there was plans of setting up bombings and a terror campaign is what they called it, in U.S. land, which they mentioned Miami, they mentioned Washington, they mentioned Tampa, and to blame those bombings and terrorist campaigns on the Cuban government to facilitate the manufacturing of consent for regime change in Cuba. So what we've seen over the last 60 years is, again, a by any means necessary philosophy that the U.S. has used to attempt to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And what we've seen repeatedly is that it fails. I mean, I think there's 638 attempts on Fidel's life via the CIA, and they've all failed. Some of them are actually quite funny in the creativity that they've taken to do the deed. So, and the CIA actually hired the Mafia for this dirty work. It's that unsavory relationship really is not talked about enough. The CIA failed so often in their attempts to assassinate Castro that they actually hired the mob to do it for them. Isn't that correct? Yeah. Well, another important thing to remember is that Cuba is Vegas before Vegas, specifically Havana. Havana is the city of sin, and we see this in I think in Godfather 2, the film. But Havana would end up what Vegas would eventually end up becoming. So you have there the mingling of the interest of the owning classes in the U.S., of U.S. politicians, and then of mafia members that are controlling the scene over there with casinos and all other sorts of activities that eventually, would be translated to Las Vegas.
And that was the mob's justification for taking the contract, that the Mafia's playground before Las Vegas was in Cuba and was in Havana. There were casinos, there was prostitution, there was drugs, everything that the old Vegas used to be known for was preceded by Sin City in Havana, and then Castro came into power, and the Mafia lost everything. They were pretty angry, and they were a natural ally for the CIA to take Castro out. You talked about Operation Mongoose and the Bay of Pigs. I'd like to talk a little bit about Operation Northwoods, which for our listeners was, and this is hard to believe, and it's actually related to 9/11. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation against American citizens. It originated with the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962, and the proposals called for the CIA to stage and actually commit acts of terrorism against American military and civilian targets and blame it on Cuba with the purpose of justifying a war against Cuba. To some conspiracy theorists, Operation Northwoods was dusted off on 9/11 and employed again. But the point is that as far back as 1962, the shadow government in the United States was proposing false flag attacks, and this is called Operation Northwoods. You could look it up, and to blame it on Cuba for the purpose of declaring war against Cuba. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Comment on Operation Northwoods, if you would, please, Carlos.
Well, it's perhaps one of the most disgusting of attempts at overthrowing the Cuban Revolution, specifically because, as you said, it turns towards its own citizens to use them as a tool for regime change in Cuba. So I think operations like that and attempts like that help us remind ourselves when we turn on the TV and we see the media, mainstream media, or now social media as well, saying things are going on in Cuba, we have to have a humanitarian intervention, or we have to crack down on this or that. And when I say Cuba, I mean, everywhere else as well, Venezuela, all other countries in the Middle East, everywhere. So it's important to note that where American corporate interest is, there will be a by any means necessary philosophy to attack that which threatens it. And Operation Northwood is perhaps the scariest we've seen of the extent towards which the government, coupled with corporate interest, is willing to go to overthrow
extreme extent. In researching the show, and again, I was in touch with some of Oliver Stone's production staff, because we'd like to get him on the show, and we'd like to have him discuss his new movie, RFK Revisited. But in preparing for this show with you, I filed some Freedom of Information requests about this Operation Northwoods. In 1962, I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was a guy by the name of General Lyman Leominster. And in reading about the mission of Operation Northwoods, I'm going to quote from a document that was declassified, and I'm quoting, "The desired result from the execution of this plan, Operation Northwoods, would be to place the United States in an apparent position of appearing to suffer from defensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba, and to develop an international image of Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere." This is unbelievable, Carlos, that our own government would be creating these kinds of lies, these kinds of fictions, and these kinds of pretexts for war. Pretexts for war that much later found itself in our phony war against Iraq. Just talk about this history of deception, and I think it rises to the level of treason.
It absolutely does, because it doesn't represent the whole of the population. No regular average working class American benefits from our interventions in other countries. On the contrary, they end up damaged. They end up coming back with both physical and psychological damage, and that's if they come back alive. So, like you said, this can be fairly called treason, because it does end up representing only a small portion of the American population, which is the folks that own and the folks that have material interest in these interventions. But when we analyze it systematically, in terms of how is it that modern political states come about, what we see is that every modern political state seeks to, at least in the ideal level, present itself as a universal state, as a state that represents all of the people of the population. But what we see that de facto is the case is that the modern state is shaped and works in such a way as to facilitate the reproduction of the existing social relations. So the modern state's aim is to sustain the owning class in power and to allow, in countries like ours that serve as a global empire, to allow the owning class to expand as much as it can their control over other countries' resources to expand its capital. So it is on one end treason, but I guess if you interpret it almost perversely as what is the actual aim of the state under capitalistic relations, it is doing what it has to do, which is sustain the dominance of an owning class that seeks to constantly expand.
It's 31 minutes past the hour, and we're going to take
the
a
one
brief
person
pause.
who stood in the way of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and these lunatics at the Department of Defense in trying to stop Operation North? In March 1962, he stepped in, and I'll give you a hint. Of the 1,521 pages of once secret military records from 1962 to 1964 that were recently declassified, can you guess who stepped in and said no to these lunatics? It was President Kennedy, my friend. It was President Kennedy.
John, we need to take a break on the half hour if we could, and then we'll return with more discussion on this. Thank you if you've just joined us. This is Heroes and Patriots. It's 9:32 here on the north part of California. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowitz, who is joining us this morning via telephone. We are speaking about the Republic of Cuba. Our guest today is Carlos Garrido. Mr. Garrido is a Cuban-American philosopher, professor, and graduate student at Southern Illinois University. He's a co-founder and editorial board member at Midwestern Marx and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. He is also a political analyst with a focus on Latin America, especially Cuba. Mr. Garrido, welcome back to the program. We'd like to continue the discussion that you and John began a few minutes ago. If you'd like to complete your
Mary,
thought.
may I ask a follow-up question of Carlos?
Sure, absolutely.
Carlos, we were talking about really the terrible lessons of Operation Northwoods, Operation Mongoose, the secret war against Cuba that really rises to the level of treason, and perhaps the connection to the assassination of President Kennedy. My question is this: how do we get this into the civics books of today? How do we teach children the truth of our government? How do we get this into history classes? How do we get this into the civics books?
Well, I think it's going to be very hard, because in the same way that the classes in our country that benefited from these interventions, the classes that eventually ended up taking out President Kennedy, they don't just dominate the media, but they also dominate, what's in school curriculums and stuff like that. So it's always very difficult. But I think our main axis now is the ability that technology has given us to counter these propaganda campaigns and to create sorts of projects that attempt to move beyond and expose the truth. So I don't know if it'll ever be able to become mainstream in the sense of textbooks, unless there's like a qualitative move beyond what the sort of relations that we have currently. But I think there's definitely efforts that can be made so that this information becomes popular in the U.S. And I think using social media tools and projects like, the project that I work for is attempting to do precisely that, amongst with other things, but educate the populace at a mass scale about the truth of what their government and the owning classes in their country is doing, not just here, but abroad as well.
Carlos, we have a listener who would like to ask you a question. Listener, if you're still on the line, please go ahead with your question.
I'm here.
Go ahead with your question.
I want to thank K-Mod and Carlos and everyone who's doing the show talking about this topic. I know we live in the United States and Cuba is our neighbor, so we have a special relationship. And me in particular, I grew up in a family that, well, to make a long story short, the Cuban Revolution was really important in in my history. And I remember listening to Radio Havana, Cuba, and thinking, oh, these guys are talking about all these good things that, all these things, crazy, terrible things the United States has done. But as time's gone on, I feel like there's a generational gap happening where in the past, a lot of the stories that you're talking about, all the histories you're talking about, are important to remember, but time has changed, and we are in a new era now where, we need to talk about what's going on today. And I just personally, I feel like, the Berlin Wall, we don't look back on that and be like, oh, it's so sad that the Berlin Wall fell. I'd like to talk about what's going on today in Cuba, and I'd also like to point out that the left has this blind spot when it comes to Fidel Castro. He can't do anything wrong. He's like a martyr. He's almost a demigod. Mm-hmm. So everything the United States has done it might be terrible, but we don't look at the other side and see what's going on today with the communism in Cuba. So that's what I'd like to talk more about.
Thank you, Carlos. Carlos, would you address where we are right now?
Well, first, when you mentioned the blind side of the left, I thought you were going the other way, because what we've seen with the so-called progressive Democrats, AOC and Bernie, is that, they'll call to lift the embargo, but they'll also make false allegations about Cuba being a non-democratic society and a repressive government, which are baseless allegations. Here's the reality of Cuba today. Cuba has been under the 60-year-long embargo by the U.S. that has blocked it off from trading, something that is absolutely necessary as a small island that has 75% of their soil affected by soil erosion because of centuries of colonially dependency on sugar. So Cuba is a country that is meant to trade, and the U.S. is blocking it not just from trading with itself, which is its historical and geographical natural trading partner, but with the rest of the world. So Cuba has been historically dependent ever since the revolution on having a counter-hegemonic force, a force that's willing to tell the U.S., look, I don't care what the consequences are. I'm going to help Cuba out of solidarity. At one point, that was the USSR. And when Cuba had relations with the USSR, Cuba was flourishing. In 1979, their GDP growth was almost 20%. And it was a growth that was benefiting all of society. It's not like GDP here in the U.S., where whether it goes up or down, it makes no difference to working families in the U.S. Concretely, over the last couple of years, we saw a partial lifting of the blockade by Obama through a process known as the Cuban Thaw, which was mediated through Pope Francis. And in the years 2014, 15, and 16, the years that the partial lifting was in place, Cuba had one of the highest GDP growths in all of Latin America, and again, a growth that took part in all spheres of society. With the election of Trump and the subsequent pressure from Florida Republicans, Trump reinstates 243 economic sanctions on Cuba, puts Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list. It removes the ability to send remittances to Cuba. It eliminates tourism to Cuba from the U.S., which is one of its major industries. And then it uses the pandemic to exploit it to further these conditions. So once we analyze the condition that Cuba is in, they're against a wall and a sword. It's like demanding a swimmer to swim faster when he's tied up, his legs and his arms are tied up. The system that Cuba has right now in terms of politics and popular participation is far more democratic than anything the U.S. has ever been able to see. If we look at the process that went into the building of the 2019 Constitution, more than 90% of those eligible to vote voted, and more than 90% voted in favor of a new socialist constitution. Besides that, what went into the Constitution itself took hundreds of thousands of community meetings. So if we want to talk about democracy in a system that participates transparently with constant, consistent people participation, a democracy that's protagonistic and participatory, Cuba is the beacon of democracy right now in the world. We can't ask Cuba to do things better when they have been under this constant pressure. And not only is a pressure via the blockade and the pandemic and the global world crisis that we've seen that leads eventually, I'm sure we'll talk about this later on in the interview, to the events of July 11th. But there's also the reality that we get via Tracy Eden, who runs the Cuba Money Project, that the U.S. has been systematically funding the Cuban opposition, both in Cuba and out of Cuba.
Right.
It has also been funding groups and media, and over the last 2 decades, approximately $1 billion has gone to Cuban oppositional forces. Over the last 10 years, they have calculated that 300 million U.S. taxpayers' dollars have been used to try to destabilize Cuba. So you have a dual factor: the economic power that the U.S. has to create harsh conditions in Cuba through blockades and other activities, and then the funding of an opposition. And what do you get? You get the events of July 11th. But as opposed to what some people have interpreted the events of July 11th and the protests as revolts against the government and as a sign of the crumbling of the revolution, I think the events of July 11th demonstrate a sign of the utter failure of American imperialism that has used all of the tools in its toolbox to try to get an event like this to happen. And all it was able to conjure up was a few thousand people in a few provinces, and people who, after Diaz-Canel said, hey, revolutionaries, hit the streets, in 15 minutes they had to scatter because the streets were flooded with pro-revolutionary Cubans carrying the 26th of July movement flag and Fidel portraits. So we also have to understand those events in how they happen at the heels of a UN vote that took place in late June, where the whole world, 184 countries, with the exception of Israel and the U.S., voted in favor of lifting the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And it was the 29th consecutive time that a majority of the world votes in favor of that. So the U.S. policy against Cuba is not just criminal, but it goes directly against international will. So I don't think it's a coincidence that these events on July 11th happened on the heels of this embarrassing defeat that the U.S. has on the global scene.
Good point.
Carlos Garrido, we have another caller. Caller, if you're listening, please go ahead with your question.
Yes. Are you listening?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I am a Cuban born, and I have family in Cuba. And I'm listening to the show, and I'm perceiving that this is not so much about Cuba, but is about United States foreign policies. If we are going to talk about Cuba, we have to also talk about the repression that the Cuban government is doing to the Cuban people. And to point the revolts of July 11, it was the Cuban people that are saying no more to the Cuban government. And yeah, I understand that the embargo has done damage, but also the Cuban government has been using the embargo to oppress their own people. And the Cuban people are saying no more. They want to change. They want to change the policies of the Cuban government. And to invalidate that and to justify that with the embargo is wrong.
Right.
It's totally wrong.
Thank you, caller. That's an important point. The government is using the embargo against its own people, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, and I would like if you could talk about what is happening actually right now in Cuba. The repression of the art.
Okay, go ahead, Garrido, Mr. Garrido.
Yes, well, I think these sorts of questions arise because the media truly deserves the MVP in this whole situation with July 11th. Both mainstream and social media here. Mainstream media, prominent outlets like The Guardian, CNN, Fox News, Boston Times, have been caught using fake pictures of Cuban protests that did not happen in Cuba and did not happen the day of July 11th. They have used protests from a rally in Egypt, in the Malecon in Egypt, and they've said, look at the Cuban Malecon, the people are protesting against their government. They've used a picture of an 11-year-old that was shot in Venezuela a few years ago. Completely irrelevant. And they said, oh, look, the Cuban police just shot a 13-year-old kid. I mean, their tactics of fake news and the tactics have been getting so easy to spot where you can just get the picture and you can input it on Google and you can see when it first came up. They said
at one point, who is releasing those photos? Is it U.S. based? Is it another country? Who is propagating this false image?
Well, what was done, I know the Guardian article, for example, they posted a picture of a pro-Cuba revolutionary rally, and they said Cubans are in the streets protesting their government. CNN, they posted a picture of a rally in Miami, which had a dude with a MAGA hat. They had the Southwest Miami street sign behind that, and they said Cubans are protesting the government in Cuba. And then Fox News goes on a segment with Ted Cruz, which is kind of ironic because he's talking about the courage of the Cuban people and revolting against their government. You look behind them, and you see a picture of protests in Cuba with the signs blurred. Once they unblur the sign, what do the signs say? Oh, Patria Muerte Venceremos, the Cuban revolutionary slogan, and the other sign said, the streets are of the revolutionaries. All right, and then they switch right after to a picture in front of Versailles, which is a famous Cuban cuisine restaurant in Miami. So they've had to fabricate these pictures, and then they've had to use Twitter bots, and this is something that has been confirmed. They've had to use Twitter bots to mass spread this information in order to get the hashtag SOS-Cuba to trend on Twitter. They've had thousands of accounts that have been retweeting, that had retweeted the day of the event, SOS-Cuba with these fake pictures, 5 retweets a second at speeds humanly impossible. So the media deserves the MVP here because they have created the situation that looks like the Cuban government is repressing its people and that the people are en masse just lifting themselves up. I mean, there was allegations and video surfacing saying that Camagüey had been taken over, that communism was down in Camagüey, and that the secretary of the party in Camagüey was kidnapped. Cuban news stations recorded Camagüey, and the streets were filled with revolutionaries, and they did an interview to the secretary of the party where he's like, look, everything's been functioning normal. We've kept up our regular vaccination process. I don't know what the hell people are talking about. So,
yeah, Carlos, I hope you write to your congressional delegation about this because high-tech, these high-tech media properties like Google, like Facebook, like Twitter, like TikTok, what have you, they need to do better surveillance of false information and false reporting. And the fact that you have algorithm-driven bots, propagating false news is something that Congress has had hearings about, and hopefully it results in legislation. But unless people like you and me and our listeners write to our members of Congress who represent us, pointing these things out, nothing will change. Twitter needed to move on that. They needed to shut down those sites.
Yes. Well, it was a clear violation of Twitter's policies, and they did it, but they do it too late. Just like once the narrative is already created, just like the CNN, for example, they removed the article and they removed the picture, and some of these other mainstream media outlets, they removed the picture. That's only after they face the sort of popular embarrassment that they received. So, and by the time they do that, the narrative has already been created.
Right.
But I think it's another. Oh, in relation to what you mentioned with Twitter, I think yesterday Twitter just united with Associated Press News and Reuters, two organizations that have been shown to be funded by both the British and U.S. intelligence services, they united with them in order to crack down on fake news. So, sure, they'll crack down on some fake news and some extremism, but that definitely what it usually means is that they're going to push left, and any anti-status quo media is going to be repressed. But there's another point that I wanted to touch.
Carlos, we have another caller I'd like to get in. We only have about 8 minutes left on this important program. Caller, if you're listening, please go ahead with your question for Mr. Garrido.
Hi, yes, my name is Luis. I'm also a Cuban born. I live in the States. I lived in Cuba for 23 years before I came to the States. And I would like to ask Mr. Garrido or explain how the embargo affect not only the government, and I agree with that the embargo have done a lot of damage, but how can you say that, explains to me how the source of news that we are getting from Cuba is not from Fox, it's not from CNN, it's not from any of these media news or whatever. We are getting our sources of information from the people of Cuba. Our families are sending us videos, are sending us those pictures that you mentioned that are from Fox and things. We're getting that from the people of Cuba. We are not getting that from any official news source. The news from Cuba are totally silent about it, and they're misleading what's real happening in Cuba right now. I don't know if they understand, or if Mr. Garrido understands really where the news are coming from. Can he explain a little bit about that? Thank you.
Thank you, caller. Carlos?
Well, yes, I think there's a part of what you're saying that I don't think it's correct, which is that the Cuban government and the media has been repressing these things. Cuba is very, very transparent about both its issues and the hypothesis it takes up to solve them. And when it comes to events like this, there's literal segments on a daily basis on Cuba Debate and some of the other major channels in Cuba that are transmitted to the whole population, where they get these news that come, like you said, sometimes from Cubans, and they debunk them, and they do it consistently. Most of the reason why we know that these stuff are debunked and that are because the Cuban media has done its job at addressing them. So there's a clear transparency with the Cuban government and the media that they address all of these allegations. Another thing that is important to remember is that it's not just the blockade. It's the fact that we have systematically funded a Cuban opposition. The movements like San Isidro movement, who with the song with Gente de Zona developed the slogan Patria y Vida, which has been the slogan of the opposition. The San Isidro movement has been shown to take money from the U.S. Agency of International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED and the USAID, which are the two new fronts of the CIA. They have met with far-right politicians across the world. They have been shown to wear MAGA hats and stuff like that. So you have a systematically funded opposition that is inside of Cuba that has done everything they can to play their part in creating the narrative, to manufacture consent, and to have this. So I understand that we have family over there and that people have family that send stuff from Cuba. And obviously there's discontent in Cuba because it's natural, especially amongst the least politically conscious parts of the population. It's hard to live in a situation where you have lines, where you have shortages. But it's important to understand where that fact arises from. If we look at a fact and we don't understand the factors that led to that fact, we don't understand the fact, regardless of how hard we look at it. We have to understand the factors, and the factors are both the blockade and the systematic funding of Cuban opposition. We've had instances that have been shown that Cubans from Miami, and there have been dozens of private messages exposed that do this, Cubans from Miami bribing Cubans from Cuba with phone recharges if they beat themselves up and then record a video saying the police did it. I mean, if we know the history that the U.S. has had with Cuba, if we know the history of the Cuban exile community, who celebrates people like Luis Posada Capriles, who killed 74 innocent people in a plane crash. Nothing is off the table for these people, and that means manufacturing consent from inside of Cuba so that then they can disseminate it and use these Twitter bots to manufacture consent against Cuba and say that there's police repression and then there's all these other activities that do not exist at all. Another important point, which I wasn't able to mention with the last
Carlos,
question.
I was going to, our time is very, very limited. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Another caller,
I'm going to
John.
give you the opportunity to speak in Espanol to our Spanish-speaking listeners. We had as our guest last week Aviva Chomsky, a wonderful social scientist, and we also asked her to speak in Espanol to our listeners. I'm going to ask you to use the remaining couple of minutes of our show to speak to our Spanish-speaking listeners about some of the hope, some reason for hope that they can now find in Pedro Castillo's victory in Peru, a socialist, a Marxist. This is the People's Revolution. He is a former teacher and the son of peasant farmers. That there is hope. Not when we're making a distinction here between Communist Party and the oppressive tactics of the Communist Party versus socialism and Marxism and people's movement. So, if you will, please end the show in Spanish for our listeners. But before you go, I want to say en español, gracias por estar en nuestro programa de radio. Continua tu bien trabajo, Carlos. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, so, ¿qué se puede decir de Perú? Bueno, aunque Pedro Castillo no lo ha llamado esto, lo que ha pasado en Perú es verdaderamente una revolución. Ha sido un proceso en el que una clase nueva ha tomado poder del Estado de Perú. Ya los latifundistas, los grandes intereses de capital, no tienen el poder ejecutivo en Perú. El poder lo tiene el pueblo, el poder lo tienen los campesinos, los indígenas. Y como dijo Castillo, él va a hacer que su administración sea una administración del pueblo, que trabaje con el pueblo, para el pueblo. Es una revolución popular, una revolución que se basa en las tradiciones indígenas, en las tradiciones colectivistas y comunales peruanas, y de que se va a enfrentar a una dura oposición. Ya se sabe de que el Congreso y la derecha que domina el Congreso está planeando la posibilidad de una vacancia, de sacar y eliminar el gobierno que se acaba de elegir de forma democrática. Entonces, la batalla va a ser dura, pero creo, y no he oído que nadie mencione esto, pero creo de que la fe en la revolución peruana y en el movimiento que ha creado Pedro Castillo y el Partido Perú Libre, la fe está en los ronderos, porque si él llega a ganar la batalla legislativa, que va a ser una batalla de ajedrez, una batalla muy técnica, si él llega a ganar esa batalla, se sabe de que la oligarquía nacional, mezclada con los intereses del imperialismo americano, va a hacer todo lo posible, que incluye ataque reaccionario violento, para derrotar la revolución. Y hace pocos días le preguntaron los ronderos, que jugaron una gran parte en elegir a Pedro Castillo, y Pedro Castillo mismo era rondero, le pidieron los ronderos que armaran a los ronderos, que crearan ronderos urbanos y que le dieran el Ministerio del Interior a un rondero. Entonces, si se crea la fuerza popular de los ronderos, Castillo va a tener lo que necesita para poder defender la revolución si llega el momento en el que se tiene que defender con las armas. Y esto no estamos hablando de conspiraciones, ni de... Fidel le dice claramente a Allende en el 71, prepárate porque la oligarquía nacional no te va a dejar hacer lo que estás haciendo por el pueblo. Y en el 73 sabemos lo que pasa. No podemos seguir repitiendo el error de Allende. Tenemos que aprender de que con un Estado burgués, un Estado que representa los intereses del gran capital, un Partido Popular que representa a los trabajadores y los campesinos no puede triunfar. Hay que trabajar para cambiar las estructuras y las instituciones jurídicas del Estado. Esto es un proceso que Castillo quiere hacer a través de la nueva Constitución, pero también hay que crear una militancia que pueda defender, si toca, la revolución popular.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. finish your last thought, and we'll say goodbye.
30 segundos, Carlos.
No, that was the last thought. So we're good.
Okay. So thank you so much. We're about a minute before the